Throughout the history of the aviation industry, there have been many airlines that have come and gone. So far, for the closed series of airlines that I have covered, some airlines seem to get lost in history long after they're gone. However, there is one airline that remains in the memories of many and very much defined what global aviation is. That airline is Pan American Airways, simply known as Pan Am. When talking about airlines, no discussion of aviation history can be done without even just a reference of this airline. In the Asia-Pacific, Pan Am has had a heavy influence on many of the airlines today. So this video will take a look at the history of Pan Am in Asia and the Pacific, along with defining the airline business as we know it today. The story of Pan Am begins with one man who is in much respects a prominent figure in aviation history, Juan Trippe, a former military pilot who in the 1920s started an airline serving the wealthy elite class of the United States along the northeast coast of the US. Looking beyond the northeast coast of the US, Trippe envisioned his ambitions to start a new airline, setting his sights south to Latin America. Getting the backing of some wealthy investors, he led the formation of the Aviation Corporation of America on June of 1927, and within months the airline secured a mail contract for carrying mail to Cuba. However, the problem was that there was no pilots and aircraft. Eventually, the airline would get lucky and secured a Fairchild FC-2 plane, and the first flight of Pan American was conducted to carry mail from Key West, Florida to Havana, Cuba on October 19, 1927. Trippe would take more of a leadership role in the company, setting the stage for what would be the global airline of the 20th century. Along the way, Pan Am would secure favorable government policies for mail contracts and grew its network to cities in Latin America such as Havana, San Juan, Nassau, Santiago, and Mexico City. Looking beyond the Caribbean, Pan Am had bigger ambitions which involved crossing the oceans of the world, including the biggest, the Pacific Ocean. To do this, the airline turned to what were the flying boats, and in 1931 the first of these flying boats was received by Pan American, a Sikorski S-40. These flying boats were what we now know today as the Clippers. Using the S-40s, Pan Am would expand its network in South America and, through new subsidiaries, formed a new air link to Alaska. Beyond Alaska, the prospects of crossing the Pacific loomed, and the goal was established to cross the Pacific carrying mail and passengers all the way to the Far East, with China being the destination. The first steps to this goal was taken with the acquisition of a stake in the China National Aviation Corporation, a fledgling airline, in 1932. With this start, the task of securing landing rights and building the facilities and equipment needed for the flights to take place began. Though those tasked with the role to set up the business in China and other parts in Asia would be in for a culture and business shock, as getting business done was simply different than in the United States. Eventually, the Pan Am officials in Asia would eventually bring in a Sikorski S-38 flying boat in 1933 from the Pan Am Caribbean Service for survey flights along the east coast of China to the Philippines, a country which at the time was a U.S. territory and would become an important part of the Clipper route between North America and China. In order to cross the Pacific, Pan Am considered two routes. First, the northern route, which would pass over Alaska, Russia, and Japan, but due to geopolitical tensions at the time, the planners decided on island hopping across the Pacific, flying the Clippers from the U.S. West Coast to Hawaii, Midway, Wake Island, Guam, all of which were U.S. territories at the time, to the Philippines before arriving in China. Pan Am would secure the landing rights in Manila in 1935, and the first flying boat arrived in Manila on November 22, 1935. This flight carried mail and cargo, and there was no passengers, as during this time Pan Am was also busy building the infrastructure on the islands on the way. This included the construction of hotels for guests at Wake Island, Midway, and Guam. These projects were completed as the landing rights were obtained in Hong Kong and Macau, and services would extend from the Philippines to these cities, achieving the goal of reaching the Chinese mainland. Through Hong Kong, travelers could connect to Shanghai and Beijing through a flight operated by CNAC. Around the same time, flying boat services were also started to the South Pacific, connect travelers all the way to New Zealand, and services in Africa were started. However, plans for future ambitions would have to be put on hold following the onset of World War II, which during the time Pan Am would switch its role to aid the U.S. military assistance in the war effort. Pan Am aircraft throughout the world would be used in military flights, including flying over the Himalayas, which was referred to as the Hump. Following the end of World War II, Pan Am would resume its globetrotting, though a much more prominent change was the decline of the Clippers as the airline was shifting to more land-based aircraft, such as the Lockheed Constellations, and Pan Am would begin flights crossing the Atlantic. This was also a period when the first round-the-world flights took available for common passengers to enjoy, starting in 1947. These flights would take passengers along an island hopper in the Pacific, along to the Middle East and Europe before arriving back in North America. Pan Am would be a major international airline connection for areas that were ravaged during World War II, such as in Japan and Germany. In Germany in particular, the airline set up an internal German service which operated flights from West Berlin. The airline continued its global reach into the 1960s as the airline received its first jet aircraft with DC-8s and Boeing 707s, pioneering the way into the jet age, with the most notable achievement was starting nonstop flights from California to Tokyo in the late 1950s. Eventually, Pan Am would be called back to continue its service with the US government, specifically with the military operations going on during the Vietnam War. Though an interesting point to make with this was that, along with the military cargo flights, the airline also operated military R&R flights through other parts of Asia such as Tokyo and Hong Kong for servicemen on holiday. This leads on into the 1970s as the airline received the Boeing 747s, the jumbo jets, which pioneered aviation, and the airline was operating flights to 86 countries with 150 jets. It very much was what it called itself, the world's most experienced airline. And this time was a period when Pan Am was going through an expansion beyond the aviation business, investing in assets such as the Pan Am Building in New York and hotels such as the Intercontinental Hotel Group. The airline would also redefine passenger terminal experiences with the opening of the Worldport at New York's JFK Airport, which Pan Am was the exclusive user of the terminal building. While it was at the peak of the world and the top airline, this is a period that some would say would begin the decline of Pan Am. The airline was hit hard by the 1973 oil crisis and a failed attempt at building a US domestic network, as Pan Am was primarily an international airline. Things didn't help with the US government easing regulations on international air travel, paving the way for other US airlines at the time such as Delta, United, American, and Continental Airlines to start their own competing international flights from the US. Pan Am's leader for much of its history, Juan Trippe, passed away in 1982 as Pan Am was overcoming challenges amid a more competitive aviation industry. During the mid to late 1980s, Pan Am would sell the stakes of the routes from Tokyo and London to United Airlines as financial problems continued to plague the airline. Pan Am would eventually declare bankruptcy in 1991 after a failed bid for Northwest Airlines, and the last flights of Pan Am would be operated on December 4, 1991. It's been nearly 3 decades since Pan Am folded, though its legacy and its influence on the aviation industry can still be seen through the operating airlines of today. Pan Am defined in-flight services with offerings of in-flight meals, aircraft seating, and the role of flight attendants. In terms of airport experiences, the Pan Am Worldport at JFK Airport influenced how architects and airports planned out and built new terminals. Pan Am also defined what the behind-the-scenes work of the airlines, including flight and route planning, dealing with governments for opening new routes, and being one of the first airlines to implement a booking system in the 1960s, a partnership with IBM. Pan Am's legacy can also be seen in pilot uniforms, which traces its history to the Pan Am Clipper days. Along with defining the airline business as we know today, Pan Am was a cultural icon for those working and those flying with them. And to this day, there is a strong community of former Pan Am employees throughout the world. In Asia, Pan Am was a major influence on the aviation developments in Hong Kong, the Philippines, the US territory of Guam, and the state of Hawaii, along with being the first airline to pioneer the Trans-Pacific routes, which today you don't really need to island hop but instead take a 10 to 15 hour flight across the Pacific without any stops. While Pan Am's methods could be emulated, one thing is for sure that there will never be another Pan Am. This is because the aviation industry has just evolved so much with the advent of long-haul travel and a highly competitive global aviation scene. It will be just too difficult to make an airline that will have multiple hubs scattered around the world. With that said, Pan Am may be gone, but it will never be forgotten, as the legacy of Pan Am will live on in the airlines around the world flying the skies of today. I definitely hope you enjoyed this video. If you liked it, please like, comment, share, and subscribe. This has been Flights in Asia, highlighting the news and updates from the aviation and travel scene in the Asia Pacific. Thanks again for watching and have a great day.